Greetings, everyone. Dr. Harvison here, joined by Dr. Garrett.
How's it going?
We are today going to be discussing some squat errors, cues, and fixes, how to address some of this. Really what we want to do is in this series of exercise technique videos is give you guys some tools for coaching, right? We can discuss proper technique in the squat all day long, but until we actually get in front of a client or test some of this out ourselves, it can be difficult to know exactly how to cue and what things to change to fix some of those errors, as well as what to be looking for. So one of the things I always want to reiterate to students and people who are first teaching this is play detective. Be looking at all the major joints, understand what to be looking for as far as, what is ideal or optimal positioning. But then if you see something that deviates away from proper positioning, how do you fix that and get it back to proper position? And so what we're going to be discussing today is these are really technique cues and corrections. Not so much, you're going to have sometimes face clients or people who may have mobility or flexibility issues. Those may take a little bit longer to fix. These are things that we can fix within that same session to correct and adjust some technique to get the client or athlete in a better position. So with that in mind, Dr. Garrett, what are some of the ways that you approach the idea of cueing and correcting movement?
Yeah, definitely going to take into consideration the goal essentially of the athlete. Am I dealing with general population? A sport specific athlete is, weightlifting their sport. So there's a lot of consideration to go into with how you're going to cue and kind of understanding who you're dealing with. So also understanding their training age and their experience. What kind of neuromuscular coordination do they have? Are they going to be able to respond to the cues that I'm giving? And these are certainly fixable cues in the moment, but they may look different depending on the age of your athlete and the experience level of that athlete. So also for me is cueing context, meaning I'm going to do the best job possible to get the athlete or the client prepared during the warm-ups rather than when we're actually into the training. When someone has, 50, 60, 70, 80% of their working weight on their back, that's not the time I'm going to spend really trying to cue and expect fixes. When people are under stress, they tend to black out and kind of not really understand what their surroundings are like because they're so focused on the lift. So I want to do the best job I can preparing them prior in warm up or movement prep sessions to get them to be ready for the day. And so I'm developing my cues there for when I actually cue them and they are moving. They already kind of know the lingo, the language that I'm trying to speak, and the expectations of what that lingo is alluding to.
So kind of maybe tying some of those concepts together, as I mentioned, like the idea of knowing what each segment of the body should look like, and maybe then coaching that in the warm up. What are some effective ways you found of incorporating that into the warm up? How do you do that?
So a lot of it is just going to be training similar patterns. If we look at this, and not to go too far down the rabbit hole, but essentially what this movement is ankle, knee, and hip flexion and extension. So any
And a
movement
neutral
pattern,
spine on top of that, right?
correct. And so anything in our warm-ups that's reinforcing that, I'm definitely training ankle, knee, and hip flexion and trying to create some rigidity in the spine in their warm-up and beginning to lay that foundation so that when we get into the squat, it's not something completely new.
Yeah, I would agree. A lot of that, the warm up session is great for kind of getting a little bit of a mind muscle connection, if you will,
Mhm.
right? Like kind of feeling, okay, here's what that neutral spine should feel like. Now, when I go and get the bar on my back and squat, I've got that kind of picture in my head or that feeling kinesthetically of where I need to be in space and what my body should be doing.
Mhm.
So that's, I think, a great introduction here. So we're going to go through a series of common errors or common faults that we see kind of within some of the major areas of the body as we squat. So the first one here is an anterior knee. The knee's shooting too far forward, not getting the hip involved enough. So this is what this looks like. I'm going to play this video here. One of the things you'll sometimes see is the heels coming up off the ground. Some of that's going to depend on ankle dorsiflexion range of motion and the limitations the client may have. So the heels may not always come off the ground, but as you look at this movement, you can see the knees are the first thing to flex, and they're moving pretty far forward or anterior. Sometimes we may want a more quad dominant style squat. If we're training for an Olympic lift or doing a front squat, for example, we're going to see more of a knee dominant or quad dominant squat. So there are places where that's okay. But for general purposes, we would want to get the hips a little bit more involved than what you see here. And it's not a major difference. That's one of the things that I think is, again, the importance of playing detective is you're seeing small little things a lot of the times. It's not, a heinous error. It's like, hey, let's make this a little bit better. We can tweak that a little bit. So like, I mean, this doesn't look terrible in this position here, but we would still want to fix this a little bit for a general squat to get the hips more involved.
I think really, let me jump in here. I think because if you
Absolutely.
pause this, or even if you watch the movement, it's like, well, that's not that bad. I think ultimately, though, what we're thinking about is as loads increase, and then just again, patterning people's movement. If it's knee dominant patterning versus hip dominant, we're going to miss out on a lot of potential power production because we're pushing into our knees as the primary mover, or to initiate the movement rather than setting it into the hips, which is a much larger muscle group that ultimately that hip extension is really where the power is centered or provided.
Yep. Well said. Yeah. I like that. I think that's a good distinction to be made there, that this is not necessarily a terrible squat pattern, but it could be better. So for me, one of the things that I like to do if I see this error, one of the ways in which we can quickly fix this, if a client just simply hasn't been taught how to squat before, or perhaps this is a common mistake they make, is just a quick reminder: hips back, or push the hips back. Some kind of a quick cue about getting the hips to move first. Essentially, the goal would be if we flex the hips first, more likely we're going to get more hip involvement throughout the course of the lift. So whether it's just saying or cueing hips back, or one of the ways in which we can do this is take the client to a wall, have them stand with their back to the wall, maybe 6 inches away, and have them flex the hip and touch their butt to the wall. That's an easy kind of tactile cue that they can feel immediately as far as, oh, that's what I need to be doing to start the movement. One of the concerns with that is we don't want to turn this into a good morning where the hips are going back and our torso is getting too horizontal. We also don't want it to be a two-part movement, right? I'm kind of exaggerating this where you see a start and a finish. We want to smooth that out eventually where it's just a quick initiation of the movement with the hips, but then it's hips back and down immediately. So it's not a chunky kind of start-stop type movement. Anything else you want to add on that side there?
Yeah, you
Eric?
alluded to both of them where you said hips back and then also using the wall as a tool. And this is kind of where I'll jump in for my input on this one. I was trained to provide clients or athletes with a mechanical, an emotional, and a tactile cue. Now, if you're working through that sequence and the mechanical works, great. You don't have to go through the emotional and the tactile cueing. But by giving athletes and clients these three different options, you're going to meet the needs of each of your clients. Meaning, for the mechanical cue, it would be as simple as, hey, push your hips back, or lead the movement with your hips. It's very direct. It's very pragmatic. The emotional cue is going to reach those that need to connect the movement to something else that's familiar. For example, if they're not pushing their hips back first, and when you say push your hips back, they're not, it doesn't make sense. It's not connecting for them. You can give them something in the real world that they can connect to. So for example, when you have one arm full of groceries, the other arm with your kid in it, and your hands are full, how are you going to close your door? Well, you're going to push your hips back into the door. That's an emotional cue because you can connect the act of closing a door with the movement that you're executing for this particular lift. And then finally, a tactile cue. And you also alluded to this, where if you say, hey, push your hips back, and they don't do it, or hey, pretend like you're closing the door with your glutes, and they don't get it. What you can do is essentially get in their way or give them a target to reach. And the chair would do this, but more specifically in an effort to lead the movement or begin the movement with the hips pushing back. What you can do is have them face or have their glutes to the wall, or maybe a few inches from the wall, and have them begin their squat, but say, don't bend your knees until your glutes hit the wall. That might help initiate a hips back first. But again, as you also mentioned, we want to make sure that we're not getting stuck with a two-part movement. But those things will get refined as your neuromuscular coordination improves. But from a cueing perspective, trying to give them a couple options, if they're not, rather than keep saying, push your hips back, push your hips back, push your hips back, that's clearly not working. So we need to go to the next level and try to connect with them in another way.
That's the old definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over and expecting a change if nothing's happening. So I completely agree. Find ways. Every client or athlete's going to be different, and they might respond to different things. And that's part of the art of coaching, is finding what that specific individual responds to and using that to improve. So One of the other ways I really like to teach the squat, almost for just about any general adult population, athletes don't need this as much in most cases, but even some athletes have some pretty heinous form. So if they've never been under a bar before or never really been taught to squat before, one of the things I really like to use is a box or a chair. There's a few reasons I like doing this. Number one, especially for the deconditioned adult population, sitting back and getting the hips to move as far back as they should is oftentimes if they feel like they're going to fall over. And this provides a little bit of a safety net. They're not going anywhere. So it allows them to at least mentally kind of, let the guard down a little bit, not be so scared of falling over. And one of the other great benefits is it establishes depth for us. That's another often common error is not reaching depth. So we can set up a box or a chair to specifically the specific height that we want, whether it's parallel, above parallel, below parallel, etc. You can control the height of the squat. And when I do this, there's a couple of different ways to approach this. One, you can actually have the athlete client sit on the box first and then kind of establish a squat stance and a torso position, or you can do kind of what I've illustrated here, which is squat to the box or the chair with, getting the hips back and just touch down. So that's one of the differences here. I'd probably use this approach more for an athlete or someone who has at least a foundational squat technique where we want them to touch the hips down, but I'm not really putting a lot of my full weight on the chair or the box. With someone who's more deconditioned, I might actually have them sit first and then establish a squat stance and position and stand from there. But that's one of the things I really like using is in those first few days of teaching a body weight squat, in most cases for the deconditioned, it's start with a box or a chair, learn that proper technique, learn how far the hips should go back, and then transition that into a free squat or free body weight squat. Anything else to add there, Dr. Garrett, on fixing the anterior knee cue or fault?
I think you got it.
Okay, well, thanks for watching that. We're going to come back with a few other common faults and discuss how to fix and coach those as well. So stay tuned.